Hello, today we're talking about graphene and the fullerenes, but first we're going to look at graphene. Now, graphene is a single layer of graphite. So we could describe it as a single layer of carbon atoms. And as you may remember, in our graphite, the carbons were arranged in hexagonal rings. So if you look over here, you can see a hexagon of carbon atoms. There's 3 examples right there in the structure. The other thing to remember is that each carbon in the structure is bonded to 3 other carbons. Apart from the ones on the edges, each carbon is bonded to 3 others. So there you can see each carbon bonded to 3 others. 2 examples just there from the diagram. Also, just like in graphite, the bonds are actually covalent bonds. And as we know, the covalent bonds are very strong. So that means it takes a lot of force to be able to break those bonds between the carbon atoms. We also have free electrons because carbon atoms can bond with 4 other atoms, and in this case there's only 3 bonds, so we have a free electron in the outer shell, and we'll see why that could be useful. So graphene is a very strong substance. So the graphene itself is very strong because each carbon atom has strong covalent bonds holding them together. It's also a good conductor of electricity, and the reason it's a good conductor of electricity is because it has those free electrons. And as you know, free electrons can move through the structure. They can carry a charge through the structure, and therefore this graphene becomes a good conductor. It's also flexible as well, and the reason it's flexible is because it's made of only a single layer of carbon atoms. So graphene has a lot of potential uses, all being currently researched. New uses coming up all the time. But what are they? Well, if we're thinking of possible uses, they're going to be linked to the properties of the graphene itself, and that's linked to how the structure of the graphene is in terms of the carbon atoms, the bonds, and the free electrons, and so on. So possible uses include in electronics, for example, in computers, but also in materials. So one use I saw recently reading about this was in bulletproof vests. It's very light and very strong, and therefore that could be a potential use instead of a substance that's currently used called Kevlar. Graphene is actually stronger than Kevlar. So that's our graphene. What we're going to look at next is the fullerenes. So the fullerenes are made of rings of carbon as well. In this case, they could be rings made of 5, 6, or 7 carbons even. But they are molecules of carbon, and they are all hollow. Molecule of carbon atoms that are hollow. And here's our various rings, 5, 6, and 7-sided. Now the first fullerene ever discovered is called Buckminsterfullerene, named after somebody called Buckminster Fuller. I think Buckminster was actually his middle name, but it was named after him. And they're also called buckyballs, and each one of those contains 60 carbon atoms. And these are made of a combination of 6 carbon and 5 carbon rings. 6 carbon and 5 carbon rings. So there's one 6 carbon ring, and next to it there you can see, I have to highlight it there, but you can see a 5 carbon ring. Another 6 carbon ring there. Now you may have noticed this little football in the corner, and the reason why I've got that there is because the structure of Buckminsterfullerene is very similar to that of a football. Each 5-sided shape is surrounded by 5 6-sided shapes, and that's how a football is arranged, and that's similar, or in fact the same as our buckyballs, Buckminsterfullerene. We also have another type of fullerene, and these are nanotubes. So we still have hexagonal rings, but they're not arranged as ball shapes or spheres, but they're actually tubes, hollow tubes. And you can see how the arrangement looks in that diagram there. And again, one of the key features here is that they have what we call a high length to diameter ratio. A high length to diameter ratio. In other words, their length is very long compared to their diameter, which makes them long and thin tubes. But we have other properties as well because of the way they are bonded, and we have carbons with covalent bonds. We have other properties for these as well. Remember, just as in graphite, we have each carbon bonded to 3 others, and again that's done covalently. That looks terrible. Let's just tidy that up a little bit. Attached to 3 others, and that's done with covalent bonds. And again, I know I say it a lot, but it's very important. Covalent bonds are very strong. So what kind of uses do we have for these? Well, Again, uses in nanotechnology, electronics and materials. So in terms of electronics, because they are excellent conductors due to those free electrons, they can be used in electronic circuits, and for materials. So for example, bike frames. Bike frames can be made strong and light by incorporating nanotubes. And in fact, one common use we have already at the moment is that of tennis rackets. So tennis rackets have long nanotube fibers that make them strong and very light. In terms of Buckminsterfullerene, or structures such as Buckminsterfullerene, what are the potential uses there? Well, one thing you might read about is this idea of drug delivery. So this is drug delivery to body cells within the body. And the reason for that is that the drug or molecules of the drug can actually be held inside the buckyball or the spherical structure, and that means that drug won't interact with anything until it reaches the cell that it's targeted to reach, where the drug can be released. So this is a potential use and area for research in terms of using buckyballs, or the type of fullerene called the buckyball. Now, this is a very important slide because you are very likely or very possibly going to get a use of these that you may never have come across, and you have to think of how nanotubes and fullerenes might be useful for the property that you've been given, or the use that you've been given. So the key properties are that we have high electrical conductivity, and that's because there are free electrons that can move or carry charge through the structure. We have strength, and the reason we have strength is because we have covalent bonds which are very strong, require a lot of force to pull those apart, and there are many of them. We have something called high tensile strength. Now this is the fact that it takes a lot of pulling force before you can actually break them. It's not about stretching, it's about the force that's needed to actually break it when you pull it. And then we have the fact that they are very light and they're made of carbon, and carbon is a non-metal. Okay, so these are key features and reasons for those features that might help you to evaluate the use of fullerenes in an unfamiliar situation. So here's one example that you might have. Wiring in an aircraft. Well, that's good because it's the fullerenes have high conductivity, high strength, high tensile strength, and they're very light, which means you save fuel, and it makes them very useful for wiring in aircraft. One other possible use would be conductors in computer circuits, and again that's because of the high electrical conductivity, and that makes microchips and that sort of thing more efficient, and actually increases the memory and makes them much faster and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so this is the idea of the fullerenes. There's a lot of research going on into the uses of these, and that's going on constantly, but these are the features and the properties that might make them useful, and you can use in a question where you might have to evaluate their use. Okay, so thank you for watching, and I'll see you again soon.